learn. Thank you guys for being patient with me as well. Okay, so here we go. Yes, boom, we are live, ladies and gentlemen. This is Tio and the Arcane Bear. I have a wonderful guest for you today. Charles Hoskinson, the founder of Cardano and one of the original co-founders of Ethereum, early interest in Bitcoin. And one of the things that melted my heart most was your talks and your interest in Kiva as well. I didn't know anyone else knew about Kiva. Charles, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Oh, it's good to be here. Thank you so much for having me on. How's Costa Rica?
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. I live kind of in the middle of nowhere, and luckily we have fiber optic internet. So there's this unique potential where we can even do live streams in the middle of nowhere, which is kind of impressive to me. How about yourself? You're in Colorado, is that correct?
Warm, sunny Colorado. Always warm, always sunny. Sometimes Colorado. I'm out in Longmont, just nearby Boulder.
And you have a farm there as well, right? So we're both interested in farms right out the get-go.
Yeah, it's small. I have 50 acres that, it's funny. I grew up in Hawaii. So you say I have 50 acres. They say, wow, that's huge. But, you're in Colorado, nearby Wyoming, and they say 50 acres. Like, that's not a farm. That's a ranchette. That's a house. So I grow hay and I have horses and I have 10 chickens and mini donkeys. And at some point I'll get some alpacas and, I'll be able to shave them and and make the yarn. And I'm setting up a mushroom farm there as well. So I'm building a whole solar setup for it. And we're thinking about growing them in shipping crates, but we're still trying to figure out how to do that. We're going to grow lion's mane reishi and not cordyceps, but
Cordyceps.
Oyster.
Okay.
Oyster mushroom. Cordyceps you can't really grow. They're a parasitic mushroom, and they like take over insects and they burst out of their brains in a really horrific way. So they made a game about that.
It's a fantastic, this eclecticness about your character has been one of my favorite parts. And I've been kind of dabbling, learning more about venture capital in my day, and more so than technology. I think people and the social aspect of the interest of a business and a community, and often the commercial aspect of it, really has to do with the people that are leading this. And everyone in my live streams kept saying like, well, what about Cardano? I'm like, well, guys, I don't know anything about Cardano yet. Like, I don't really know. So I decided to tweet at you. So I'm really grateful that you take the time to be so social and interactive with your communities. I think it's extremely important. And these kind of avant-garde aspects of your character really come close to home. I'm a big fan of lion's mane, reishi, cordyceps mushrooms. Paul Stamets is one of my favorite characters to listen to about this stuff. Yeah. So I guess before we get to avant-garde and go off the beaten path, let's start where we are today. Tell us a little bit about what Cardano is working on today, and we'll backtrack into some of how we got here. But I kind of want to start on a more of like a pertinent moment, I guess, with today's story.
Sure. So Cardano is a third generation cryptocurrency. It's there's a whole collection of them. You see the Polkadots and the Tezoses and the F2s. And basically the point of a third generation cryptocurrency is to be scalable, interoperable, and sustainable. So scalable means that as you gain more users, you keep the performance or resources of the system, or you get more. So, things like BitTorrent are examples of very scalable protocols, because as more people download the video, the faster you get it. Basically that simple. The problem with Bitcoin and Ethereum is they're the opposite. As you gain users, you get less parts of the pie for everybody else. It's kind of like, putting more chairs around a table. It's like you're not making more food. You're just dividing up the food amongst everybody in smaller and smaller portions. And that's why fees are so high with Bitcoin and with Ethereum. And that's why these systems have kind of a maximum supply of capabilities. So the scalability has been like this hidden gem that people have been chasing for a while. And third generation cryptocurrencies all have special purpose protocols to accommodate that. Interoperability is, we have over 8,000 cryptocurrencies, 3,800 dApps, and that's just our industry. But then there's also the legacy industry. And so every nation in the world has different systems. So the question is, how do you talk about them, move information, people, and value between those systems? And then finally, for sustainability, that's the who pays and who decides part of a cryptocurrency. So who pays to maintain it? How do you do that? Normally you have custodial entities like Microsoft to Windows and Google to Android and Apple to iPhone. But what happens when you remove the custodial entity and those business models behind it? Then who's in charge? How do you actually make decisions? How do you evolve the system? How do you pay the millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars of R&D money required to stay competitive and grow, especially against well-capitalized legacy actors? So the point of a third generation cryptocurrency is to keep the stuff we know and love, keep the decentralization, keep the smart contracts, but then also bring new protocols to bear for governance, for treasury management, for interoperability, and for scalability. So we began the project back in 2015, and we took a very first principles approach where we said, look, we're not going to borrow anything. We're just going to hire a bunch of scientists, and we're going to start with the design requirements and the business and technical requirements. And then we'll just go build a bunch of protocols and fill in all the broken windows along the way. So we kind of redid the science of the whole industry, written out 94 papers, over 10,000 citations. Most of our papers are peer reviewed at major venues. And we have 25 PhDs working with us, 4 research centers all across the world, from Tokyo to here in Colorado, here in United States, in Wyoming, University of Wyoming. And that allowed us to get a first principles view of basically what is a blockchain, what is a consensus protocol, what is a programming language for smart contracts, what's an ideal accounting system. A lot of moving pieces there, very complicated. And then from that, we said, okay, let's go from a research project to a full tier commercializable project, and let's see if we can implement it. And so we started building it. And we started that in 2016, and we released the first version in 2017. And the most significant update was the Shelley update that was done last year, where we went from a static and federated system to a dynamic and decentralized system, and now one of the most decentralized cryptocurrencies in the market. And the purpose of all of this is targeted towards the developing world. So we say, okay, well, who will benefit from having a financial operating system? Who will benefit from being able to teleport value instantly anywhere in the world, or being their own bank, or being their own identity service, or having control over their reputation and credit or their data? Well, probably not the people who live in rich countries, because they already have all these systems. They already have all these people that are working every day to provide those services to them. But when you go to Ethiopia, or you go to Dominica, or you go to Senegal, or you go to Vietnam, there those systems aren't as mature as they need to be, and so literally billions of people are in some way excluded from the global economy. And the point of our industry is to say, can we come up with a universal protocol for everybody that treats everybody the same? So you can be Jeff Bezos all the way at the top, or you can be a poor farmer all the way at the bottom. You both have equal access to a world financial operating system with the same capabilities and the same terms of service and quality of service, which is not the case today. And in many cases, that system can be vastly superior to the legacy systems that we have in America and Europe. And over time, we can bridge the two, and then eventually one will eat the other. So we built Cardano was a scientific eye, but there was always a mission, a vision about bridging the developing and developed world, and providing a financial operating system to those who don't have one, and economic identity to those who don't have one. So to that end, in addition to running a science company and an engineering company, I also had to figure out how to run a company in Africa and other places. So we set up offices in Ethiopia. We've been in Addis Ababa for 3 years, and we've educated people there, built up a local labor force there. And we've had to learn how to be government contractors in these strange jurisdictions, which is interesting. There are cultural and linguistic barriers there that were in some cases greater than I anticipated, but that's okay. We've been at it for years, and we've gotten quite good at it. So in addition to building great cryptocurrencies and doing great science where we really excel, we're excited because we're starting to see these markets open up. And that's really what's going to lead to massive growth and adoption of the protocol, especially when we talk about DeFi, because there you're like, well, who's going to actually need peer-to-peer lending? Who's going to actually need peer-to-peer insurance? Well, probably not the kids in New Jersey. It's a fun thing for them, but it may be the only way you get credit, liquidity, risk protection, and market access if you happen to be, let's say, a poor farmer in northern Ethiopia. So that's what we're focused on, and it's been a privilege of a lifetime to watch it grow from something small to something so large in just 6 years.
This was one of the things that really attracted me. Or am I muted right now?
No, I can
No.
hear
Okay,
you.
good. This is one of the things that really attracted me to during your TED Talks conversation. You were talking about the difference of access of information to some degree or another, financial and identification. I think this is one of the parts that a lot of the time people kind of gloss over, most likely because they were born somewhere like the United States, Australia, Canada, where if you lose your passport or your birth certificate, the infrastructure to be a person is actually still very easy to get back into. Now, I couldn't imagine what it would be like be living in Vanuatu during a hurricane and you lose your passport, you've pretty much at that point lost your form of identity, which means you have no access to some of the simplest forms of just being a person in this ecosystem.
Right.
Do you think you can, from what you've experienced by working in Africa, how are solving some of these, especially the identification aspects? I think that the book Leonardo de Soto around the mystery of capital, how we
Right.
create and generate wealth from our ability to have private ownership, whether it's in business or in the property that we own. Are you finding ways at these early stages, especially with the identification, that you're able to overcome this stuff?
Usually there you have to ask, what's the root of trust and who's already been in the identity business? So it's not the case that governments are doing nothing. In fact, more often than not, they do have some form of an identity system. The problem is that identity system doesn't have redundancies. It's subject to corruption and coercion. It's not universal. So some people are in it, other people are not in it. And every major government, regardless of Ethiopia or United States, they are interested in a digital identity. And there's a big digital identity movement that's happening. It's being led by numerous organizations. Like you have the Self-Sovereign Identity Movement, you have the DID standard from the W3C, you have the DIF, the Digital Identity Foundation, which has 35 members, including Microsoft and our company. And all of us are kind of building identity frameworks. So the question is, what is the lowest cost way to issue and validate credentials? And then how do you handle the tricky parts of credentials, such as revocation and reputation management? Okay, so there's one thing to say, this is Charles Hoskinson. It's another thing entirely to say, is he a good man or a bad man? Is he creditworthy? Is he not creditworthy? Is he trustworthy, not trustworthy? It's usually contextual and referential. And then the other thing is, what happens if I lose my phone or my identity document, as you mentioned? How do I revoke the old credential and create a new credential, and who issues that? It's very simple to do that when you have trusted third parties, because you just have to convince a bureaucracy that you are who you say you are. And actually, in the United States, it's actually very problematic for homeless people. If they lose their identity, it's extremely difficult for them to get back into the system. Like, how do you apply for a passport or a driver's license or state ID if you have no birth certificate, no social security card, or visual identity? And the last time you've had one was 20 years ago. In fact, there's organizations, charities in the United States that do nothing but try to get people who are homeless back into the identity framework, because after they're out, the longer they're out, the more problematic it is. So there are numerous techniques that you can use to onboard people, and it just depends on the context. So usually the ministries that we partner with to try to facilitate that are ones that involve things like agriculture or other such things, because they've already built in some form of a communication and economic channel with the farmers. If you're a smallholder farmer, for example, in Ethiopia, the ministry there is the Agricultural Transformation Agency, and they're in charge of all 15 million smallholder farmers. They're farmers on less than a few hectares of land. And there they give them fertilizer vouchers. Okay, well, that's a kernel that you can latch onto and actually start building an identity system around. And then usually what you do is you try to introduce the identity system into some commercial activity. So if you are a coffee farmer, for example, and there's a supply chain, then you say, okay, well, you have to have some form of identity to use the washing station for sale of your thing. Oh, okay. So that's a way to onboard them there. Then what you can do is you can gradually build in some sort of communities, checks and balances. Like, for example, when I was in South Africa, we visited the townships and we talked to this one venture called Inlu, and they were dealing with the incredibly hard problem of getting land titles and deeds for township properties. And it turns out it's like there's no records there. And even if you have a deed, it was probably a deed that belonged to a guy 12 generations back, because 12 sales back, because it costs more to register the property than usually what they sell for the property. So nobody bothers to do it. They just handshake it. So I asked him, I was like, how did you solve that problem? How did you actually understand who owns what? He said, oh, it's very simple. We go to the oldest woman we can find who lives nearby, and we go talk to her, and usually she knows what's going on. And then we cross-reference her story with the other old woman. And, at some point, the granny network will basically get us to where we need to go, but it's a super labor-intensive process. So how you go about the KYC is usually in partnership. So it's a public-private partnership. It's usually connected to some commercial activity, and it's usually connected to the social group that the person happens to reside within. Then there's the question of where does the credential live? Does it live on a phone? Does it live on a piece of paper? Does it live in the cloud? And there's some sort of meat space access point, like a merchant or something like that, who can look you up, or something like if you forget your gym pass, usually they can look you up your phone number or something like that. So you don't really need to carry a card if you want to just log in with your phone number. And then also, how sophisticated do you want to be? So there's a lot of discussion about biometric authenticators. Those are usually the username, not the password. So biometric allows you to at least say, okay, I think I'm dealing with this particular person. So you can do fingerprint, irises, you can do face scans. You can also even scan the vasculature in the hands, and that's a unique fingerprint. There was even a phone that allowed you to do that for login. It was an LG phone. You could hold your hand up in front of it, and it would recognize the vasculature in your hand. So there's many different ways of identifying people, and many different ways of baking security in, but that doesn't handle the reputation and the revocation side. So, onboarding is usually PPP, and it's reputation, and it's talking to the social network to verify, and it's connected to commercial activity. Then you have, all kinds of devices, and you have to make decisions of how technical you want to be, from paper to deep digital, like a cell phone. And then there's access control concerns there. And then there's revocation. And the revocation is often the most difficult part of identity. How do you revoke it and rotate credentials, either organically or because of theft or loss of a device or compromise of the credential? You will have so many people in the identity space. Oh, we solved identity. Zero knowledge, this and that. And you say, okay, well, how do you revoke credential? Oh, well, there's a way of doing it. It's like, yeah, okay. Do you use a central entity for that? Well, maybe. Yeah, okay. That's a problem. So there are ways to do that in a decentralized way, but they're not exactly user friendly. And that is a problem. So that's why the public-private partnership is usually a nice component of it, because they can act as the entity of last resort for revocation and issuance of new credentials. They can also assist in the KYC component of it. Now, our hope over time is to create different and better systems that are fully decentralized for revocation. But that's a mileage may vary situation. But then there's portability. So that's another component of identities. And it's basically, okay, after you've been onboarded, after you've been authenticated, after we have a good system for issuing and revoking, and we have a reputation system that's flowing, and we can start talking about you. Well, how do you take that identity and move it from one system to another? For example, your eBay power seller rating doesn't transport to Facebook or to YouTube. Oh no. So you spent all this time, effort, money building a reputation and identity in one system, but then the other systems are incompatible with it. So imagine if you have an identity and it lives on one blockchain, let's say Cardano, but then how do you move that to Ethereum? That's why I say third generation cryptocurrencies, this has to be a feature of how to move people, information, and value. Well, identity is all three. It's connected to a person. It tells you something about the person, and it certainly has economic value. In fact, your brand and reputation is one of the most valuable things you have, especially in the developing world and in the developed world, where that goes and take it. And so anyway, that's another thing. And the good news is that problem has actually been mostly solved because of the hard work of the W3C, a standards body that standardizes HTML and CSS and all these other things. They also established a standard for identity called the Decentralized Identifier, and that's called a DID. And they've been working on it for 8 years. And now that standard tells you how to make it portable and self-sovereign, and how to attach that to multiple blockchain backends or centralized servers. And we've built a system that's compliant with that. It's called Prism, but Microsoft has built one and so forth. And that DID is almost like JSON. Once you know how to parse it, doesn't matter who wrote it or what's in it, you have a way of moving it around between systems, both permissioned and permissionless. And that's super important because you don't want vendor lock-in, because whoever controls your identity controls your entire economic life. They're the ones who get to decide who you can do business with. They're the ones who get to decide if you get credit or not. And it's a real bad deal if you say that's a single vendor who has dominion. You should be in control of your identity and be able to move that identity from one place to another place and so forth. Very complex topic.
Yeah, I think people seldomly gloss over the and really miss how important it is, because a good majority of the world is dealing with this problem. Now, I think where you briefly touched into probably a more relevant aspect of this is maybe the social media space. how this digital identifier can be used and say, well, if they try to kick me off Twitter, or if YouTube, how do I have that branded reputation where now instead I can just move all of that over to this, you can find me via this blockchain identifier. How does this type of digital identity and branding also lead into the social media aspect? I mean, because so many people share their birth dates, their birth names, all this relatively, I guess, kind of prudent information on the open web. Do you think these digital identities will also seep into the social world, like whether it's your Twitter account or your, like, let's say my YouTube account, for instance, as well?
Yeah, it's a good question too. And unfortunately, like all good questions, it doesn't have a satisfying, complete, concise answer. It's one of those it depends things that as adults we fall in love with, but as children we hate. So when you talk about social media reputation, that's always contextual and referential to the social network you're in. So if Bob says Alice is a bad person, well, the first thing you're going to ask is who is Bob to assess the character of Alice. Now, if Bob happens to be the head of the religious organization you belong to, and he's a very reputable person, that's one thing. If Bob is a weirdo homeless guy on the side of the street, it's like, oh, he's probably crazy. Maybe we don't think that's a good assessment. But the problem is you have to know something about Bob. Well, if you lose access to your social network, you'll see these pointers, but you can't actually explore that social graph to understand more about that context. So reputation is a referential thing. The other thing is that the identity being portable and the data being portable, that has nothing to do with the utility or value, or very little to do with the utility or value of a social network in general. The value of a social network is directly connected to the size of the social network and who in your personal social network happens to be in that social network. So there's plenty of people who hate Facebook. They don't like the interface. They don't like the culture. They think Mark Zuckerberg is poor man's data, and they've watched all the deep fakes on YouTube, yet they stay on it. Why? Because their mom's on it, because their grandma's on it, because their aunt is on it, and so forth. And it's the only way they can stay in contact with them. And so it's not a matter of them just simply leaving. They have to actually have their entire social clique extract themselves as a unit and move over. But then the problem is that there is transitivity there. So when you go to grandma, you might be able to get away with grandma, your aunt, your brother, your sister moving over, and that's okay. But when you go to grandma, maybe she's got a whole side of the family you don't care about, but she won't leave because she's connected to them. And therein lies the stickiness and the resilience of large-scale social networks, regardless of how egregious the conduct is. That transitive cliquish that keeps people anchored is super difficult. So if you had alternative ways of communicating with them outside of the network, and you could still see the content, then these networks wouldn't be so sticky, because the information, the social graph, the curation, all that stuff is just basically are like a river, and the social media platforms are like boats on the river. They're ways of navigating it, they're ways of understanding it, mining it, but by no means do they restrict your access to the river. The problem with the social media platforms right now is they own both the river and the boats. They control who can sail on the water, and when they kick you off, you can't be on the river anymore. So that's a huge, huge problem, and it's beyond the scope of digital identity to solve that. Digital identity is a necessary condition, but not sufficient to resolve the issue of social media. You certainly need it. It's helpful to have it. It's helpful to have multiple identities, some aliases and some real life identities. It's helpful to have zero knowledge proofs there, because what you want to do is threshold proofs, where you can have discussions where you're dealing with somebody who's a member of a set, but they don't reveal who they are. For example, when you buy a beer in the United States, you have to be over the age of 21. How do people show that? They show it with their driver's license or something like that. But now they're revealing their name, their exact age, their gender, their address. Some driver's licenses, I think, have social security numbers on them if they're an organ donor, a whole bunch of information they just frankly don't need to know. The waitress only cares about whether you're over or at the age of 21. That's called the threshold. So, we need more granular proving systems in our identity systems and so forth. So these are the problems that, we tend to think about, the rivers that we tend to sail. And we also think about social media, but that's a completely that's in a slightly orthogonal conversation, and it involves, in some cases, significantly more interesting and deeper technical problems. Not to say that identity is not a huge technical problem. It is certainly one, but it's something that as a society we're a lot better at because we've been doing it for decades, and we have a lot of research behind it and best practices behind it. And now it's just a matter of, can we apply what's working in centralized systems and reapply that to a decentralized system and remove middlemen? That's the big challenge of our time.
Yeah, I think with it's become more prominent now when, well, first off, when they removed Donald Trump, I have no dog in the fight for that one. But I think more specifically, the noticeable one was with Parler. We're like, oh, well, we'll just remove you from the App Store now too. There's
Right.
a big discrepancy, and I'm really interested to see how these decentralized protocols can help solve those issues. And the identifiers and the pointers to like your specific part of the chain seems like a really interesting place to be able to do that.
Yeah, and that was a collusion issue. It wasn't even a deplatforming issue. It's one thing to deplatform people because the whole argument is, well, build your own competitor if you don't like the way we're curating things. That's exactly what Parler did. They said, fine, we'll construct our own community. And then what happens, the entire tech industry got together and said, well, we don't like you competing in this way, so we're just going to unilaterally deplatform you. And so you no longer can compete with certain types of speech. And that's much more like an antitrust issue where, certain companies got together and they could control the shipping price of oil, and so they got to basically decide who wins and who dies in the oil industry just by a cartel. And historically, for over 100 years, that's been a massive no-no in America. And it looks like the social media companies and the platform providers, the infrastructure companies, have gotten together to control the new oil of the 21st century, information. And they basically get to decide who has access to it and who doesn't.
So let's kind of rewind for a little bit here and go back through time and take a look at some of the history of how we got to where we are today. You were an early investor in Bitcoin and a mathematician. And just as a side note, I've been a really big fan of someone named Jim Simmons. He was
Yeah.
originally a mathematician.
I know him very well. I used to play chess with him years ago. I lived in New York, and I was in Central Park, and he would come play games with me on Tuesdays. And I had no idea who the hell he was for a long time. And then towards the end of that, someone recognized him and told me who he really was. I thought he was a homeless guy because he always wore the same damn suit. But yeah, he's a mathematician. He's a billionaire. He's worth about 20 billion bucks. And Jim was at I believe MIT and Berkeley, and he worked
Yeah.
with Chern, who was a very famous topologist. And there was the Chern Simons invariant that they came up with, and there's a whole bunch of beautiful topological problems and other things that they thought about. And so he was a very, very good mathematician. He was also a code breaker. He worked for the Defense Department during the Vietnam War, and he broke a lot of the North Vietnamese codes. So he's done a little bit of everything. He's just a true polymath. And somewhere along the way, he got tired of being poor, like most mathematicians. And instead of complaining about it, he decided to go into trading. And he started a hedge fund called Renaissance Technologies in 1979. And they created something called the Medallion Fund. And it's probably one of the most successful investment vehicles of all time. If you put $1 in it when they
Yeah, it
started,
is.
I think it's worth like $50,000 or $100,000 today. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. So what part of this story kind of reminded me of Jim for some reason. I love that you were able to play chess with such an interesting person. And the other side note there too is I have a few different friends who have over their lifetime started multiple billion-dollar businesses, and they all dress pretty nonchalantly, like dirty white t-shirts. You could never really tell that they have any money in the background. I always find that interesting about these characters. So let's go back to these early mathematician days for you. And I guess this was also the early days in Ethereum. When you first kind of found Bitcoin and Ethereum, can you bring us back to those early moments? Because you were quite a young man at that point.
Well, I was in cryptocurrency in 2011. Ethereum came about in 2013. And in 2011, I was still doing math stuff. And I had these dreams of one day being a professor. And I studied a field of math called analytic number theory, and who the hell cares about that? I was particularly interested in integer factorization. So there's like a subtopics and additive number theory I was looking at. So like sieves and these things. Anyway, I was also kind of a political firebrand. So I was in the Ron Paul movement and that part of that liberty movement. And the whole Ron Paul movement really hates central banks, and they really like gold. That was the legacy we got from Ron. And so if you are kind of a tech guy and a cyber guy, and you really like computers and math and these things, and you kind of like privacy, and you think Constitution's a good idea, then you're probably in the cypherpunk movement. And then if you're a political firebrand and you really care about monetary policy, you're kind of in the digital currencies movement. So, that's where David Chaum came from. And this is where, Wei Dai and Szabo and these other guys in the 90s and the 80s. And they kept cumulatively building all of this infrastructure, but it always had some fatal flaw. Like DigiCash in the 90s, it required a central entity, a trusted third party. Even though the exchanges were private, you needed a trusted entity to route things. And then, Szabo came up with BitGold and, these types of things. And so there was a lot of like almost there. And then suddenly in 2009, Satoshi kind of stitched it all together, and it was like, okay, it kind of all works. That's really cool. And so I knew about it early. I saw the Slashdot paper, the white paper on Slashdot, and I think it was like 2010. And I said, I should probably take a position and start doing so. I started mining them, and then I started buying some. I had a Mt. Gox account back in the day. Lost a few Bitcoin on that one, and these things. That's okay. But I never really took it too seriously until after 2013, right in the early days when the Cypriot crisis happened, and it went over $1 billion. And at that point, I said, this thing is here to stay. Because remember, I witnessed it go from 50 cents all the way up to $30, down to $4, and so much volatility, huge amounts of hash rate variability. Nothing worked properly. Bitmit was great. You could buy an Xbox on it. A lot of shady people, a lot of backroom alley things. Guy shows up, hey man, you got some Bitcoin? It's like, yeah, I got your Bitcoin right here. That kind of stuff, right? So you didn't really take it seriously as like a global scale system. But I thought if it's one of those chicken the egg things, if it could get to a certain level of momentum and it could get to a certain level of progress, then it's inevitable that this thing is going to be successful. Why? Because you can do things with it that the legacy system simply can't. You can teleport any amount of value anywhere in the world instantly at a low fee with no chargebacks, and you can evade capital controls. That alone is worth $10 billion. That's a big fucking deal. If you can get good liquidity with that and good markets to form, then you could see naturally financial products coming from it, identity management coming from it, property registration coming for it. And then suddenly you can have a real conversation about building a new financial system. So back in $1 billion Bitcoin days, I said, okay, this thing is going to get huge. And I thought huge meant 10 billion, $20 billion market caps and some really interesting, innovative products. The problem was that you couldn't innovate with Bitcoin. I tried. And then I got so frustrated, I created a venture called Invictus Innovations and created a product called BitShares, where we did a stable coin. At the same time, Vitalik, Amir Shetreat, and others like Jeff Wiltshire, they were working on color coins and Mastercoin, again, trying to augment Bitcoin and do something. And then ultimately they were so frustrating, they couldn't do it. So they said, fuck it, let's go do something else. And in that case, we all kind of converged together and came up with Ethereum. And the idea was adding programmability to a cryptocurrency. It's kind of like adding JavaScript to the web browser. It just made sense. And again, there was very natural utility there. It's not a coincidence that the very first Ethereum t-shirt that we had made in January of 2014 for the North American Bitcoin Conference, the back of it was source code for issuing your own token, because it was so hard to do that with Mastercoin and color coins. And it was a really bad economic experience and so forth. So, a lot of times great projects are projects of frustration and projects of passion. And Bitcoin was a great example of that. It was a reflection of the frustration of where the world was at. There's, the very genesis block of Bitcoin had embedded within it, a repudiation of the bailout policies in the UK. And of course, in America, we were feeling the exact same thing. So it just made sense to us crypto libertarian people that such a thing should exist. And after it started getting successful, we're like, we'd like it to be useful. And Bitcoin's like, well, we're not going to evolve to do that. So, okay, well, we'll go build something to make it more useful. So, we built Ethereum. And then people say, well, this Ethereum thing's a really good idea, but it doesn't scale. It's not interoperable, and it doesn't have a governance system. So it's going to become a victim of its own success. And so now the third generation is here, and you have all these people who've shown up, like the EOS people and the Tezos people and the Algorand people and Polkadot people, and of course, the Cardano people amongst the Ethereum people upgrading Ethereum to Ethereum 2. So in many ways, it just blew my mind how fast things spread and how big this industry got. I remember the very first Bitcoin conference was in San Jose in 2013, and that was supposed to be like the big one. And there's probably like 500 people there. And that was it. That was like everybody was in the room. Okay. It's like all the who's who were there. And then I go to Malta a few years ago, 8,000 people at the Maltese conference. And that's just like, oh yeah, it's just a conference, right? It's a global movement now. And it's just incredible to see where that's gone and how that's worked.
You're one of the real that Cyprus moment was one of the big moments that I kind of was my aha moment for Bitcoin. The rest of these ideas, it took me a little bit longer to figure out, and more importantly, I think that together they provide a much more valuable infrastructure when you have a collaboration. I mean, if you just look at the conceptual aspect of decentralization, if this idea of like, oh, there's just this one that's going to do all these things, it kind of breaks the idea of, well, what about the choice? One of the reasons why I was so excited about Bitcoin is because I had the choice to use that if I want.
Right.
Well, if I want to use Dogecoin and you want to accept Dogecoin, well, then great, we can use that. I mean, I don't suggest that. It's just as an example. Money has this unique interoperability between a peer-to-peer, which is if each person's willing to transact within that, then that will work. We could use anything. We used to use cacao seeds or shells from the beach to represent some type of tokenized gratitude. Now, there's probably a lot of contention around your time with the Ethereum Foundation. Can you tell us a little bit about the differences there? Because I'm sure this is, from your mathematics background, looking at business and the structure of governance. Where were some of the breaking points in what Ethereum was doing in terms of governance? I know there was the DAO hack in the.
I don't really want to talk too much about
Okay.
Ethereum. I left in 2014 in June, and there's a long history after that. It was only 6 months of my career in the cryptocurrency space, and I spent over 6 years running my own company, where I was got to top. And people often ask, well, what would have happened had you stayed at Ethereum? And I said, well, we've already run that experiment. You have Cardano. I mean, Cardano is a reflection of where I wanted and how I wanted to evolve and take the Ethereum project. So first off, there was a separation of a for-profit and a not-for-profit entity. With Ethereum, they collapsed everything into a not-for-profit, the Ethereum Foundation, and there were 8 founders. The problem there was no incentives to stay beyond the initial distribution. So 7 of the 8 founders left. There's only Vitalik left at the Ethereum Foundation. And all of the ones who left, most of them created their own for-profit companies, some of which are no longer materially connected to Ethereum at all. So there was a lot of value leakage because there wasn't proper golden handcuffs. The other big differences were things like the use of formal methods and R&D. So I very firmly believe that these new protocols are getting too complicated for hackers to meet in a basement and say, hey, let's kind of just figure it out and it works until it doesn't, because you have value at risk. It was very different in the early days of Bitcoin when there was no value at risk. I mean, all the time as some event happened and you lost a few Bitcoin, you'd be, it's okay. It's like $4. Who cares, right? But when Bitcoin is $35,000 a coin, you lose 4 Bitcoin. You're just like listening to the Doors, like debating life. I mean, it's like, what is going on here? Okay, so the problem is that as you get more users, you get more value at risk, you get more consequences. The things you have to do to ensure that the software is right, the protocols are right, the complexity goes up exponentially. The use of formal methods in software is generally only reserved for things like braking software in trains, aerospace software for your plane engines, your rockets, your medical software for your pacemaker, these types of things, where if the system fails, the plane falls out of the sky, or the train doesn't stop, or your heart stops, death or the loss of billions of dollars occurs. So that's not normal software. And the set of people who do software like that is very small relative to the 22.6 million developers floating around the world. I'd say there's probably only 5 or 10,000 formal methods engineers of all the software engineers. And many of them are in the academic world. They're not even in industry. Okay. So when you go and say, hey, we're going to be a Silicon Valley startup, but by the way, we're also going to be a formal methods group. Oh, and by the way, we're also going to set up research centers and go do peer-reviewed research. That's not exactly super fucking appealing to people who are 19 years old and this is not their thing. But you say, well, there's too much value at risk now. And so that was an irreconcilable philosophical difference. Now, To both of our credits, we were both right. Somehow Ethereum has grown from nothing to a $150 billion ecosystem, and it's really changed our industry. And there's a lot of great people there and amazing ideas there, and a lot of mistakes and graveyards that they've filled along the way, as all projects do. There's no exceptions, ours included. And then along our way, we were able to have our cake and eat it too. We built a formal methods group. We wrote formal specifications. We do formal verification. But then we also wrote 94 papers and actually went through the peer review process and so forth. So I'm glad it ended the way it did. It was better for the industry and it was better for all of us. But, it's a thing that I always get asked about, and there's multiple books written about it, like The Infinite Machine and Into the Ether and so forth. And, some of these authors decided to make the books very adversarial, especially Into the Ether, where I just come off as a raving, deranged villain. And I'm just like, guys, I was there for 6 months. It was very stressful. I was 25 years old. We were all doing our best. It was a startup where we were literally sleeping on concrete floors. Why do you need to invent villains here? 8 founders, it's not going to work out. Some of them have to go because your vision has to consolidate. You can't have 8 visions. You have to get people either to demote a bit and take a back seat, or you have to have some people go away because your vision needs to be crystal and clear. I mean, name one great startup where they had 8 founders. It's usually 2 or less, maybe 3. And then the third one does one specific thing and the other 2 kind of try to run it. And then usually one leaves. Paul Allen left Microsoft, Wozniak left Apple, and so forth. So it was never bound to work the way that it was structured, set up. And the space is better that we all went off and did our own things. But it's just weird because it's the question I always get in every interview, like, tell us about Ethereum, and we spend 30, 40 minutes talking about it. And I say, well, I have 6 years of history since then. I've been to 52 countries since then. We wrote 94 papers since then. We wrote 1 million lines of code since then. We built an ecosystem with 1 million people in it worth $12, $13 billion off $70 million in funding. That's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. And I love to talk about those things because not only is that bigger part of my life by a factor of 12, it also is what's relevant today. And I'd like to believe that we've had a huge impact on the industry. In fact, if you look at our citation count, over 10,000 citations, and every one of our 3rd generation competitors have read, or in some cases are using our papers as a basis. Like, for example, the consensus algorithm of Polkadot was derived from Ouroboros, a product we created. The sidechains protocol that Blockstream is so enamored with comes from a protocol called NEPA-PALS, non-interactive proofs of proof of work. We came up with that. We even wrote our own snark to replace the one that Zcash uses, called Sonics. And we fully implemented that and so forth. And so we've left a big legacy in this industry and also outside of the industry in more traditional software, like in the Haskell ecosystem. And that's so much more interesting to me than the interpersonal conflicts of, well, who fought who and who said who, and who's the villain and who's the hero. It's like, come on, get past that. We're all entrepreneurs trying to change the world. Let's focus on that.
Yeah, I think you've answered my question perfectly there in that sentiment, and I agree. I think decentralization requires the option and the choice. Now, one of the pieces you touched into, which I have, was more of an esoteric question, I guess, to some degree. The Ouroboros is a Greek mythological snake that eats its tail. Can you tell us how the relationship of that name of this mythic character and the protocol, do they have any relationship together?
Yeah. So the thing about Ouroboros is that it has this concept of epochs. And so an epoch is a period of time and it has a certain amount of slots in it. And the basic idea is you bootstrap it somehow. It runs and runs and runs. And then as part of the closing process of that epoch, that 5-day period, where you can parameterize it to other amounts like 10 days or 3 days, there's security parameters in the paper that tell you how to do that. At the end of the process, it'll bootstrap the next epoch. So it's kind of like a snake eating its own tail. So the end is the beginning and the beginning is the end, that kind of an idea. So we felt it'd be really cool to attach it to some mythological concept in that respect. And it's a really elegant protocol. And there were so many problems we had to solve when we created it. Like, how do you handle the notion of time and build a clock and a distributed? That's a very classical consensus problem. And there are many opinions on ways of doing that in our space that are reasonable. And we even wrote a paper called Ouroboros Chronos, which we think completely solves that problem. Then there was also the issue, where do you get randomness from? and what is the good enough. So we started with a very heavy random number generator that involved multi-party computation, which is pure, awesome, great randomness, the kind of stuff you'd get from cosmic rays, but it's too heavy. So we then said, hey, how about we use a VRF instead? And this was an idea inspired from what Silvio Macaulay did with Algorand. We said, wow, that's a brilliant idea. I mean, he created the VRF. So, you know, who are we to challenge the great Macaulay? This is an approach. But the problem with that randomness is it's a bit dirty. So it's not as pure and magical as the truly random numbers. So we had to figure out, like, how dirty can we get? You know, can we still be a good Christian but go to the strip club on weekends? You know, like these were the existential questions we were asking ourselves in the research. Then there was also the question of fairness. So is it a plutocratic system? You know, is it a system where the rich will take all, it's winner take all? And that was, so we kind of had to figure out how delegation and stake pools and economic incentives were going to work. Then we had to create economics that allowed the system to get more decentralized as the price went up. So you have physically more people participating in consensus as the price goes up. Bitcoin has the opposite relation. As the price goes up for Bitcoin, economy of scale kicks in and you get more vertically integrated on mining, and you have fewer and fewer mining pools because they move from public ASICs to private ASICs and into subsidized power and large data centers. So your price of admission for a large mining operation is now in the hundreds of millions of dollars. That's not a public activity. You can feed all the people that run that with 2 pizzas. Okay, so that's not a decentralized system. The way we designed the system, we had the building economics in a way that as the price goes up, you actually end up having more distinct stake pools and actors inside the system. So we started a few hundred, now we're at 1,500, and eventually over time, go 10,000, 20,000, and that's the hope. And then eventually you can turn it into a parallel computing thing where each stake pool can actually process different forms of state instead of uniform state amongst everything. So as you add more decentralization, the system gets faster, which achieves that scalability requirement that we had. Now, this is not a single paper or even protocol. It's actually a family of papers. We started with first, what is a blockchain? We didn't even know what the fuck that was. So we created the GKL model back in 2015. And we spent quite a bit of time. It's actually one of the most cited papers now in the cryptocurrency space, over 900 plus citations. And it created a very rigorous 3-pronged model for how to describe the security and properties of a blockchain. And then we proved that proof of work creates a secure blockchain. Great. So we have a security target. So then when we talk about provable security you still there? Lost your webcam. Well, anyway, when we talk about provable security for, I think the live streams. Okay,
no,
good.
We're still live. Just 1 sec. I apologize.
Oh, no problem. Okay, just wanted to make sure I wasn't talking to a vacuum. So when we talk about provable security, at least we have a target. We know what a blockchain is. We know what proof of work is. And so we say, okay, now we wrote Ouroboros, but then we still had to deal with adaptive security, and we had to deal with semi-synchrony. So realistic network conditions, and also the make sure adversaries can't DDoS your pools, these types of things. So that was Ouroboros Prowse. And then we wanted to have the same security property Bitcoin has, the ability to bootstrap from Genesis. So we did that. Then we had fixed the clock. And there was just so many other little things we had to do. So it's been a 6-year agenda, and we've written almost a dozen papers specifically on this topic. And every long way, we've submitted them to major academic conferences like Crypto and Eurocrypt. And these are not cryptocurrency conferences. These are cryptographer conferences, the kind of stuff that comes from the 1960s and 70s and 80s that kind of built all modern cryptography. So, there's mythological connections, but there's deep scientific inquiry there. And it's inspired a lot of derivative work, and it's inspired a lot of conversations. And certainly it's one of probably the best research consensus protocol in the last 25 years because of the enormous commercial effort and all the collaborative authors. I think there's been 12 authors from 8 or 9 different major institutions that have touched the Ouroboros research agenda over a period of 6 years. And all of the major papers have been at top tier conferences. So it's been fun to work on. Maybe we'll write a book or a monograph or something at some point.
This is I think part of the aspect too, is it's such a difficult conversation to understand. So for instance, one of the things you went over, which I've been trying to figure out, what's the importance of this verifiable randomness? Like how do you explain it to a layman like me who's spent most of my time sitting outside and watching the sun? How important is this verifiable randomness?
Well, I mean, that's easy. That's easy. So imagine you're gambling against a server, like for example, you're playing blackjack. So when you play blackjack in human life, you have the dealer and the dealer playing against you. And he's like, giving you cards. You want to believe that the deck is randomly shuffled, but it doesn't have to be. What if the dealer had preset the cards up so that he always gets good cards and you get bad cards? So what does a dealer do to kind of give you some faith in the process? He shuffles the cards in front of you. Now, if you believe that shuffling is a randomization process, then you will be satisfied that you're playing a fair game. But the problem is, what happens if you can't see them shuffle the cards? And this is the problem when you gamble with central servers, right? So you're playing blackjack against blackjackstars.com or whatever the hell these sites are. Well, how do you know that that's a fair deck? Well, they have to have a random number generator. But how do you know it's not biased so that they win more than you win? Well, you trust that maybe a regulator or somebody stepped in and done that. Well, what if you had a cryptographic protocol that you could verify the person's running and you trust the protocol to produce true randomness? Then that protocol would guarantee that they're shuffling correctly. And that has to be done for a proof of stake system. Why? Because we are replacing traditional proof of work where it's a meritocratic thing and your computer's chipping away at computations with a synthetic lottery that's proportional to your amount of stake that you have in the system. So if you have 25% of the stake, of the total stake in the system, you should win on average 25% of the time. So if you flip a coin twice, maybe your round is heads, heads. Okay. But what if the randomness is biased? Then what can happen is, even though you have 25%, maybe you only win 8% of the time because I biased the numbers in a way to reduce your chance of winning. So you have to have faith that the randomness in the system is secure, it's true. And that was the point about, heavy versus light, dirty versus pure. What is okay from a probabilistic point? So generally how cryptographers do this is that they compare your pseudo-random number generator to true sources of randomness, and they make a probabilistic argument. So they say, can we differentiate between the true stuff versus the pseudo-random number generator? And it's like Westworld. If you can't tell the difference, doesn't matter. And so that's what they're looking for as cryptographers. And they're really interested in, can we quantify that? And also, is it always the case? Or are there special cases where you lose some of that for a variety of reasons? So it's a really involved topic. Cryptographers have studied this for over 40 years, and there are dozens of protocols that exist to produce truly random numbers, usually through some form of distributed process, like a multi-party computation protocol or a collective work problem involving commitments and so forth. And it just so happens that the VRF, the verifiable random function, is a really good one for a protocol that has adaptive security in a semi-synchronous network. What that means is that it's a protocol where you know after the fact, but you can't predict it beforehand. And it's a protocol where your network conditions are suboptimal. So in an optimal network, you're like the Googleplex, and your local network and all the networks are connected to each other. You own those computers. You're using high quality fiber to connect them. They're not going to go down. But in the internet, that's not how it works. You're in Costa Rica. What if there's a hurricane? I'm here in Colorado. What if there's a snowstorm? What if there's an earthquake somewhere and cables get cut and you have to go through seldom used back things? So networks are very finicky in that respect. So all the time you have people have high latency, packets get dropped, EMI comes in and distorts and turns bits around. So fault tolerance and the ability to handle an adaptive network is very important. The problem is that consensus protocols, when you start introducing semi-synchrony or asynchrony, they don't tend to work so well. In fact, we even have things like the FLP impossibility theorem that make prescriptions about what is your capability in a truly decentralized sense, in a truly asynchronous sense in a network. Okay, so your randomness that you generate can't be reliant on synchronization as well. So it has to be deterministic and survive bad network conditions and adversarial connections. So I'll give a great example of a protocol that Intel came up with that only runs on trusted hardware, and it's trivial for any person to break if you don't have trusted hardware. So there's something called proof of elapsed time that's part of the Hyperledger Sawtooth project. It's Intel's contribution to enterprise blockchains. And basically how it works is you have a random number generator, and everybody gets together and they run their random numbers, and whoever has the lowest number wins. Now, if that protocol wasn't running on trusted hardware, you could guarantee you always win. Why? Because you could just set your random number generator to always return the minimum value, right? So that's not Byzantine resistant, but because it's running on SGX, you can't manipulate the hardware to change the code. So that's why Intel gets away with it. And it's super efficient protocol. So, operating environment has a lot to do as well with randomness and trust and security. But it's a big topic, and it's one that cryptographers have really fallen in love with. And the math there is quite elegant, and there's a lot of beautiful things about it.
So, yeah, this is part of one of those interesting things too, where my general study was never in mathematics. So I'm always trying to find out. I think you did a great job explaining it there, especially with it makes obvious sense. I don't want it to be in a gamble with someone who's going to be betting against me and have that verifiable, or like not know where the deck has been shuffled. That was really poignant. I appreciate that. So because there's such a complex conversation around these types of citations, where would someone like me go to spend time doing homework on learning more about this? Because in general, I'm not a coder, I'm not a developer. My interest is mostly to as a venture capitalist to put money where I think people have that great exponential growth. Their ability to pivot and try new things is important. Is there light reading in this sector at all?
Okay, so it's the same situation you run into when you deal with medicine or physics or any of these other fields. There is a domain expertise that's required that creates a humongous barrier to entry for the actual papers. It's not to say you can't read them. I mean, they're all public. And if you go to our website, like iohk.io, we have a whole library of all of them there. But then also they're on ePrint and archive and these other services. And, people cite them and you can see hundreds of citations. The question is it right? And so when you look at, for example, the vaccines that have been coming out, well, are they safe and effective? Who the hell determines that? Well, we have this idea of a clinical trial, but then somebody has to review the data. So there's a peer review process and there's a regulatory body that's responsible. So most people say, well, okay, if it's gone through clinical trials and the regulator says it's okay, maybe multiple regulators have said it's okay, and maybe it's been published in these certain journals, at that point, I'm okay, right? And that's their personal threshold. Now, most normal people, they can't read the medical science and go through it and actually come to a conclusion themselves because it's really hard. There's a lot of domain specific things that only doctors or medical researchers understand. It's the same for physics. Eric Weinstein, for example, he's a very prominent podcaster, but he's also a trained physicist, and he was at Harvard, MIT, and these other places. And he says he has a theory of everything, which is the holy grail of physics. So is he right? This whole idea of geometric unity. So he'll go on Sam Harris's podcast and talk about it, Lex Friedman and these other people, and you kind of hear it and he's kind of explaining it. But then who's in a position to really understand that? There's probably maybe 500 to 1,000 people that are so deep into physics that they could actually read his papers and critique them at that level. So what most people will do is say, well, has the mainstream physics community vetted him? Yes, no, do they believe that this is right? And that's basically the point of peer review. It's not necessarily a veracity machine in that it guarantees something is right, but it becomes an evidentiary data point for you as the consumer to say, is this research correct or not? Because oftentimes what I can do is I can summarize the paper. I can say, here's how the Ouroboros protocol works. Huzzah. And, if I do a really good job of that, you'd have a basic understanding of it. But then you'll ask the question of, how do I know it's secure? Because the Bitcoin people will show up and they'll say proof of stake is perpetual motion. It's impossible. It can't happen. Anybody selling you proof of stake, it's snake oil. And here's a paper about it. And I say, well, that's wrong. Here's my paper about it. And so now you have these two papers. They're filled with lots of math, lots of symbols. And you're like, well, okay. And if you have the domain expertise, you can read the arguments, come to an opinion. But more often than not, what most people do is they say, who do I feel is a more credible authority to believe? Okay. And that's why you go through a peer review process, because that's blind. They take the names of the authors off the paper. The reviewers are also anonymous, but they're within a set of domain experts. You apply to a conference. Most of them only accept 10 to 20% of the papers that are submitted because they fail to meet the novel and the correctness standards that the conferences have. And then you have to go show up and defend your work. You get yelled at by people with PhDs from Harvard with 30 years of experience who are angry for some reason. I don't know why, but they are. And so that's at least something. that you can put your hands on. But then you look at citation count. You say, okay, well, if it's really a real paper and the academic community thinks it's right, there should be derivative work from that paper, and there should be lots of citations from that paper. So, for example, anybody can go and look at the GKL model that we came up, or Ouroboros, Google it, and they can look right there at the citation count. I think there's over 900 of them. That's a tremendously successful paper. Most papers don't get that many citations. So that's a foundational piece of work. So what it's saying is at least 900 other scientists who are writing academic papers have read that paper and have found something in it that's novel or necessary for their paper, and they're connecting it to their paper. So the duration of time it's been in the commons, the amount of citations, the peer review mechanism that's followed, that helps you know if the science is right or not. But then there's a whole engineering reality that comes in. The academic world is filled with protocols that simply do not work in practice. They work on paper, but then when you try to build them, they're impossible to build. Geometry is filled with all kinds of hypothetical structures that you can't actually draw or visualize, right? Well, similarly, the computer science world is filled with tons of protocols that you can't actually run on a normal everyday computer. So then you say, is there a prototype? Is it deployed in a production system? These types of things. Okay. So for example, Cardano, we've been running since 2017. And this version of Ouroboros has been running since July of 2020. Okay, so what does that tell you? It tells you there's a data point there where you can look and say, what was the network quality? Has the network ever gone down? Did it require centralized intervention to restart the network? Was there a hack or some event there? Because you've created a honeypot worth billions of dollars for attackers to come in and try to break it. With proof of work, for example, the security fine print says it only works if you have 51% honest miners. Well, how many 51% attacks have we had for small cap coins? A lot. So you can watch by the operating model the sins of the system, where it fails, where it's successful, how resilient it is, how much attack it's gone through, how much external scrutiny it's gone through. And finally, you have the imitation game. So imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. And if you notice that people tend to copy your work and replicate your work, it's probably an indication that the work is reasonable as a starting point. Bitcoin is the most cloned of all coins. Litecoin came from Bitcoin, Dash came from Bitcoin, Monero, I think, came from Bitcoin, Zcash came from Bitcoin, and so forth, as did Namecoin and so forth. So that's a good indication that multiple independent teams said this idea is a good enough starting point for us to build on. Well, similarly, the Cardano's core protocol, Ouroboros, has been copied by Polkadot, and they took it in their own particular direction. And we're starting to see a lot of downstream inspiration that's occurring. Not as much as the other guys, because our code base is in Haskell. It's a very exotic math programming language that is not so mainstream. So there's a lot less Haskell developers, and most of them work for me. So we haven't quite seen that diversity yet, but we do see it in other parts, like our cryptography and so forth, because that's implemented Rust and so forth. So, there are examples of things. Now, is that perfect? No. There's still reasonable people who could disagree and say, we would like to wait a little longer. We'd like to, it's just like the same thing with vaccines, right? Some people say, I want to see 10 years of safety data before I think it's safe. Okay, pandemic's probably going to be over by then, but if you're willing to wait that long and hope you don't catch it, good on you. And that's fine. That's a personal decision that people make. And cryptographers are notorious for this. They'll say, that's a relatively new protocol. We have to be really careful about that. And they're talking like Schnorr-SIGs. It's like, well, hang on a second. Didn't those come out like 2000? It's 20 years old. Yeah. It's a new protocol. Well, because RSA has been around since the 70s. Elliptic curves. There's a great paper from Koblitz. He's an old friend of mine. Koblitz is the inventor of elliptic curve crypto, and he teaches at the University of Washington. And he was a Putnam fellow, went to Harvard, really brilliant mathematician. And somewhere in the 80s, he realized that these elliptic curve things he was playing around with were a mathematical structure that most people didn't give a shit about, turned out to be really, really useful for doing cryptographic operations that were much more efficient than anything that RSA brought. You didn't have to factor integers or do discrete log or any of this. It was a completely different way of doing things. The problem was that it was a new way of doing things. So he wrote a paper called The Serpentine Path for Elliptic Curve Cryptography, which talked about how difficult it was to get people to pay attention to his work. And no one really paid that much attention to the early 2000s, mostly because engineers couldn't afford to use RSA. It was too computationally intensive, and the proofs were too large and the signatures were too large, and they were trying to save space. So they were looking for some alternative, and the professional cryptographers were like, what are you doing? Don't use elliptic curve crypto. That's not secure. What's wrong with you? But then after they got some progress, then like the NSA and the NIST and these other guys, okay, maybe it's okay. But it took 20 years to get mainstream adoption of that. So everybody has a different time horizon, even amongst professionals and so forth. And I feel that at the very least, you need proper specifications. At the very least, you need academic peer review if you're doing science, okay, if you're doing things of that novelty. And it shouldn't slow you down too much. We were first to market with our proof of stake. We beat Ethereum to it. And they'd been working on Casper a year longer than we had. So obviously, it didn't slow us down. We were actually faster in certain respects. And we had to build a whole science group, and they already had one. And they already had a whole engineering group and a whole ecosystem before we did. So I think in the beginning, it's a little slower, but in the long term, you get a lot more on the tail. And then you get independent third-party validation that the claims that Charles is making and the scientists working with his organization are making are true. And then it's your decision of whether that meets your standard. And if not, well, then, okay, you have to at least be coherent about it. Say, well, what is your burden of proof then? And as for summaries, we try to do those. We do YouTube videos, we do conferences and lectures and write blog posts. And if you go to our blog, there's tons of stuff in layman's terms explaining how our protocols work. And if you go to our YouTube page, you'll see tons of videos about how various things work. And some are academic and some are more mainstream. We try very hard to explain these things, but they're difficult topics, and you're only going to be able to get so far with analogy.
You actually had me sold at when you mentioned Kiva in the first talk. So everything else here is gravy for me, and I love this learning process. I think very often people, for some reason, they become almost cultish about the things that they're interested in. My whole life, I've just been trying to learn more, and that curiosity road is like a rainbow path for me. I'm really excited about it, and I'm really grateful that you take the time to go through and write those and to share with people like me who tweet at you and go, hey, you want to help explain some of this to me? Because it's a really difficult process. And I'm sure a big part of the problem is that conversation, as you brought up with things like vaccines, where the average person is just so far removed from the scientific conversation in most ways that it's quite hard for us to digest and understand the relative importance of some of this. So I'm part of the question I want to know about is the economic incentives and commercialization of blockchains over the next few years. How does Cardano, well, I'm not to be price focused, but how does the price of the token end up being used in the model, just for say, like maybe an example of, I think one of the things I'd listened to in a previous podcast was you guys are verifying credentials that are coming from some of the universities that you work with.
Yeah.
What does the economic model look like here for that type of content on the blockchain?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a snowflake in that respect. So every deal is a little different, and the economics are always different in each and every deal. So the things you would do to attract like a peer-to-peer lending service like Celsius versus a credential verification play like what we're doing in Georgia and other places, that's a facts and circumstances thing. And oftentimes you have a blockchain component and you have a non-blockchain component. So you have to think about off-chain, you have to think about on-chain. And usually what you do is you push a lot of your costs out to the off-chain infrastructure because it's much more efficient. And the blockchain is the trust broker. So that's the auditor. It gives you immutable records. It gives you time stamping. So you know when things have happened and the order in which things have happened. And you maybe hash records as an integrity layer or something like that. So a lot of your DID mechanics, for example, for like a cell phone app for identity and payments, that's going to live on a central server with your cell phone. But then the records of those things would live on Cardano, for example. And that massively reduces the total transaction volume, your operating cost. And then it gives every user of the system basically the world's best accountant that's keeping track of everything and verifying that the history that they're looking at is correct. Because even if the central operator tries to change things, it will then show that there's been manipulation in the record. And people say the hashes don't match. Okay. So how we do that is on a case by case basis. And, the economics are different. And usually they don't come to us asking for a blockchain. They'll say, hey, we have this problem that 26% of the people who are from our country claiming they have a college degree don't actually have one. And it's making our entire country get blacklisted from international employers because they think all our credentials are made up. So how do we create a system where we can get rid of that academic inflation? Okay. They didn't ask for a blockchain in that brief. So when you do the PSG work, the professional services group, you're creating solutions architecture, what you'll do is you'll say, by the way, we think by adding this system in, not only does it improve your security and outcomes, but it also makes your stuff a little bit more portable and a little future-proof you for all these different types of verticals, like voter registration or property registration or rah-rah or whatever. Oh, that's a great idea. Let's do that. Okay, so that's how you get adoption when you're doing government or Fortune 500 or any business contracting, because you're basically saying, hey, we're trying to solve your problem. We did a deal with New Balance, for example, and they have this problem with counterfeit sneakers. So we're saying, hey, how about we have a blockchain component for that? Oh, yeah, okay. And they created real chain on Cardano. But that wasn't part of the design brief. It was more of, well, we should probably add that in because that's sexy and interesting, and Nike's doing it too. Okay, so the economics of that deal were a little bit different in that particular case. The individual user there, it's usually a crisis of confidence in their surrounding institutions. In the developed world, it's a crisis of confidence because they feel the institutions are somewhat predatory to things they highly value, usually privacy. In the developed, developed world, excuse me. In the developing world, the crisis of confidence is usually in the stability of the institutions. For example, if you're in Argentina, you've probably endured more than one currency collapse during your lifetime, and civil asset forfeiture, people taking money out of your bank account, suddenly, assets being seized. I met a gentleman, a very old gentleman in Argentina when I was down there years ago, and he took me to his house and he showed me where he buried his silver during the currency crisis. And then he took me to the backyard and he showed me where he buried his real silver. So not only did he bury silver, he buried decoy silver from when the police showed up trying to steal his silver. It's like, wow, this is like experience talking. Okay, there's like some real miles there that inform that OPSEC that you have in the way that you store things, you do things. Oh, okay, great. So when you go to people there, you don't have to explain the need for digital currencies and these things. It's more of, how do I use it? Okay, they want to use it. There's a desire to use it. They've already been totally sold that this is a really good idea. It's just the liquidity is not there. The cash in, cash out is not there. The marketplaces aren't there. The infrastructure is not there. So it's more of a game of finding the right bootstrap mechanism. And it might be through the teleco. It might be through an agricultural agency. It might be through a local cooperative. It could even be a rich benefactor. It just depends. And again, everything is kind of a snowflake. Now, you asked about token price. The token price has a very big meaning in proof of stake systems because it's an explicit measurement of security. So I can look with you a straight face and say, it costs at least $6.5 billion to attack Cardano at current market price, because that's the value of the token. Okay. And there's some truth to that. You can go to CoinMarketCap and see where we sit, and you divide it by 2, and that's how much it costs for a 51% attack. Now, in reality, there's a lot of social dynamics and other things, and people model this stuff, but it's a measurement of security. And we can all agree that the ballpark is probably around there or greater than that. And maybe there's some clever ways to mount an attack with a sub amount, but you say that the people who are attacking are people who are invested in the system. So in many ways, price, actually, the higher it goes, the more certainty you have in the system being secure, as long as that price is relatively stable for a long period of time. And the people who will attack you are directly connected to the price appreciation or depreciation. This is not the case in proof of work. In proof of work, if you have 2 proof of work chains with roughly the same hash power and the same value, you actually have an incentive as a miner to destroy one of the systems. Because what happens is you can mine that system and then short sell it while doing all kinds of chicanery, 51% attacks and all this other stuff, destroy commercial confidence in that system. It collapses. You make money on the short sale. Then you just turn all your mining power to the other chain. And then you make the same revenue as if you mined the other chain, but you also made the short sale money. It's called a Goldfinger attack. So this is why maximalism is so prevalent in proof of work systems, because they can't risk having near neighbor hash rates, because you'll have constant 51% attacks as you see price variability to destroy the operations and confidence in the system. So you don't have that in proof of stake. You can have Polkadot and Cardano be roughly the same market caps, and we don't care. It has no bearing on our security because they're fundamentally incompatible, the consensus mechanism. So it's quite nuanced. How do you achieve adoption? How much do you do organically? We even have an engine for adoption called Catalyst, where we have a blockchain treasury. It produces millions of dollars every month. And, basically you can use it to get funded for your project. We already gave away 11 projects got funded with the first cohort, Fund 2, and Fund 3 is underway. And by the end of the year, we'll have 8 or 9 cohorts that go through, and probably hundreds of projects will get funded. And then those projects are able to go and build stuff. And they say, well, where does the money come from? The same place it comes from for the miners. If you can pay the miners, you can pay people to maintain the system and to grow the system and evangelize the system. Decentralized treasuries are another great growth hacking model that can bring millions of new actors into the system.
Yeah, I love the Catalyst idea. I only got to briefly look at it before we jumped on the show. Part of my last few thoughts here is around the growth of DeFi. Now, when DeFi first came up, I swore, I was like, this is just a marketing term, and like, we've got Bitcoin, like that was decentralized finance. I was like, someone's just trying to sell me something here. I was wrong. I think I was clearly wrong in misidentifying the potential, these new ideas of automated market makers. I remember using Fork Delta way back in the day, just like a peer-to-peer marketplace. It was the clunkiest thing I've ever used. What's your thoughts on this kind of new financial Lego, and how does it fit into Cardano's ecosystem?
I mean, just look at the Robinhood situation, and you don't have to look any greater. The settlement time takes too long, 2 days, and all these short sellers getting squeezed. And on the other side of it, basically the app is selling people stock for them, liquidating their positions. They're telling them they can't trade instruments they have the legal right to trade. That's an example of curated, controlled, centralized, inefficient marketplace. The point of DeFi is to get rid of all the middlemen of necessity and replace that with a fully decentralized operating model that's fair for everybody. And it doesn't matter if you're Steve Cohen, it doesn't matter if you're Joe Schmo, both of you are trading in the same market mechanisms, and no one has privileged access to that. And that's the point. So DeFi has egalitarian value. Now, to actually build at scale marketplaces to rival the New York Stock Exchange or any of these regulated marketplaces, tremendously difficult. The other thing is it does not resolve the agency failures of information asymmetries. So the big guys in the space who build these things and talk to everybody, they simply know more than everybody else. And as a consequence, they can trade on those information asymmetries. This is why insider trading laws exist. So, there's a lot of people, depending on where they fall on the efficient market hypothesis, from the strong to the weak, who feel that DeFi is unsustainable because it doesn't resolve the information asymmetry problem completely. And you still need some semblance of regulatory oversight and centralization. And this is the argument that we're kind of dealing with. The other thing is, how do you overlay things like KYC, AML, and anti-terrorist financing into DeFi and make sure that flows of capital are regulated in certain respects? This is a big concern of the FATF and the US Treasury Department and the EBA over in the European Union. So we're working our way through it as an industry. And from our part, we build tools. So we say, okay, if you need an identity system and you want to do KYC, there's actually a way to decentralize that. And you can put it into the app itself and give economic identity, not to just a person, but to a DApp and to wallets interacting with the DApp. And so we could actually have a discussion of a whitelisted DeFi application that is not run by a foundation or something like that. It's actually run by a blockchain, but still satisfies the overall transparency regulated requirements that the regulator has for the requisite jurisdiction. What's also nice is that you can ensure that the rules are fair. Just the same way you would say the random numbers are fairly generated, you could also say that the market is fair. Front running is not happening. The ordering is fair or random, truly randomized. That everybody's paying the same price, or that the order book that I'm seeing is the same as somebody else's, and so forth. So like any emerging economy, there's 1,000 points of light, there's 1,000 blooming flowers, but very few of them survive in the long term. And there's going to be a lot of Cambrian explosion and Darwinian extinction that kind of occurs in this. And the survivors will be, in my view, significantly more resilient and actually more efficient than their legacy market counterparts. Why I'm so obsessed with the developing world is there's native access there, and the regulator is willing to work with you to install those systems because they don't have those things, but they have a liquid value that they want to liquidate. In Africa alone, there's $5.6 trillion in a liquid value, just that's quantified today, probably 10 times as much once we start really getting the ball rolling that's not quantified. China's chasing it. They put $1 trillion into the continent over the last 10 years, and as is America and the Europeans. So if we want to get out of colonial predatory capitalism, probably a pretty good idea to put a fair system in where the people can liquidate it themselves and enjoy the fruits of the labors themselves and fair markets. By the way, if you achieve that, it'll create huge regulatory changes in the Western world, not because they're good-hearted people, because they're greedy. You know, if you have two incompatible markets and there's enormous value in each of these markets, there's huge value in trying to build bridges between them and interoperability between them, because the first person to do that is going to get a tsunami wave of wealth. You know, there's no coincidence that there were all these people went to China in the 1980s and 1990s because they realized that the Chinese economy was growing exponentially, and that if they were first movers there, they would basically become billionaires. So China was fundamentally incompatible with the Western world for a long time because of the communist system that they had put in. But they realized that that was coming down. So they built those bridges, and now everything's from China. You know, my Bose earbuds are from China. You know, this microphone was made in China, probably this laptop, right? So those bridges have been built, and now the system is working. And the same thing will happen with the blockchain world and the non-blockchain world. If there's enough wealth in the blockchain world, entrepreneurs will show up to build bridges. And the thing is, the blockchain world is a stronger organism than the non-blockchain world. So it's going to eat it because this can't compete once they've been bridged.
Okay, brilliant. So just my last few thoughts here. Again, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and time with me. I can't express how grateful I am for that. I've got a few people that have asked questions with super chats, and at the end of the episode, what we're going to do is we're going to log into Kiva. I've got a few $100 in there that we're going to make a loan to an entrepreneur, because I think Kiva deserves as much highlight time as possible. These are just short, quick questions. What's your thoughts on Mars?
Going to Mars? I mean,
yes.
The magic of Elon Musk is that he is a cascading disruption engine. What he does is he finds the right market conditions to create inevitability behind his vision when it wasn't clear to begin with, but somehow it becomes like self-evident. The last person to do that was Steve Jobs. He's just amazing at this. So, you know, battery powered cars are a great example of that. You know, GM retired the EV4. They said, we're not even going to do battery powered cars back in 2000. Now they just made an announcement that by 2035, they're not going to make gas cars anymore, and 100% of their fleet is battery. I mean, that's how much market dynamics changes that Tesla got through the way that they approach things. And SpaceX is no different. So when we look to Mars, Mars was a political achievement originally. It was viewed as a marker for how great a nation state is. That was the conception we had, just like the moon. It was a challenge problem for nation states to one-up each other, Soviets or the Americans. So as to say that China or America, who will be the first great nation to take us to Mars? And because both great nations were dealing with internal problems, they kind of tabled it. Then this entrepreneur comes by and says, let's think about it differently. We're going to make Mars the beacon of an interplanetary species and a great economic opportunity for the private industry. Space mining and all this space tourism and all these cool things that could come about. And I say, wow. So what he did is he created all this infrastructure, reusable rockets, and now we have the Space Force, and now we have a big satellite network, Starlink, and these things. And so all these entrepreneurs say, not only is it possible, it's inevitable. We will go to Mars, and space is now an economic agent. It used to be a political one for nations to one up each other. So from that perspective, as an entrepreneur who's a change agent, it tells you to win the game, you have to change the rules of the game, especially for big things. You know, we look at economic identity in the developing world. Everybody looks at that as charity. They say, hey, you know, it's good people, billionaires who have already made their money through other industries, who go and want to give all their money away to help these people, or nation states that are feeling charity. If you change the game and you say, this is the greatest economic opportunity since China in the 1980s, and if you get in early, you're going to be richer than Bill Gates and Bezos combined. They say, wow, okay, I want that. And then suddenly greed is now leading the engine for humanitarian purposes. And Musk did this with Mars, and that's what we're trying to do with the blockchain industry in Africa and Southeast Asia and these other places. And Cascading disruption is just a tremendous concept, and I think it's very underappreciated in business literature.
Beautiful. Well said. I love that cosmic vision for the human species. My next thought was a bit more, again, avant-garde here. I had a podcast guest about a year and a half ago named Thomas Campbell. He was a practical and theoretical physicist. He wrote a book called The Theory of Everything. I think he was the first to write The Theory of Everything, not Weinstein. But the point of this is, or Weinstein, I don't remember if I say either of those names correctly. I apologize if I got them wrong. How do you feel about simulation theory?
Yeah, it's was it Bostrom and that whole thing. I mean, I remember taking philosophy courses years ago, and we had the whole brain in the jar argument. And I think it comes down to, if you can't tell the difference, does it really matter? There's all kinds of things in life. Like if you're stuck in a locked room, but you don't know the room is locked, and I unlock the door 5 minutes before you want to leave, does the fact that you were trapped there for 8 hours actually impact you? These are the kinds of questions you really have to mull your brain around and think about. I mean, there's certainly a lot of interesting things that would indicate that perhaps a simulation is running, like the asymmetry of matter. Why do we not have equal amounts of antimatter to matter? A lot of little things like that tend to exist. And the uniformity of the laws of physics, where you can write on a single piece of paper, all of these formulas, and that gives you a pretty good idea about how most things work, and they work in uniform ways. That's another thing you would say, maybe we're living in a program or so forth. So, I think it's like string theory. It's one of those where you have to have a testability component, or else you're just mentally masturbating. You have to take a step back and say, okay, what step of things could I construct to verify if this thing is actually real or not? Like gravity waves, they figured out a way to conduct an experiment to validate them. The Higgs boson, they figured out an experiment they could conduct to validate such a thing. And I think simulation theory falls under the same consequence. But let's say, for the sake of the argument, that we find out we are in a simulation. Would that be any different than finding out that you don't have free will and we're not in a simulation? So then why aren't we more interested in the question of, do we have free will or not free will? If you listen to Dan Dennett or Sam Harris or any of these other guys, they certainly have very compelling arguments that perhaps we don't. And we're just not aware of it because there's too much stochasticism in the world. But if you don't have free will, is that any different than living in a simulation? It's just you've changed the environment from an innie to an outie. In simulation is you don't have free will on the outside. If you don't have free will on the inside, does it really matter that if you're living in a simulation or not? You're already predestined to do all the things you're going to do, given the inputs.
Okay, the next question is about Cardano. What are some of the future exciting things you hope to see come from the development and I guess the growth of these new ideas? Like, what are the future potentials that we're just kind of stumbling into now that we're in these, what you call third generation protocols?
Well, there's a lot of cleaning up we got to do on the proof of stake side of the world. And so there's good 2-3 years of just cleaning and improving and iterating and getting all those nice to have features. And that'll happen. There's enormous competition there. I mean, look, literally one of our competitors is the guy who invented half of cryptography, Silvio Macaulay. He has a Turing Prize. It's the Nobel Prize in computer science. He's got an MIT team. He's doing good. So between him, Vitalik, Gavin, and the rest of the gang and our guys, there's just so much stuff happening there, and the paper volume is astounding. And there's literally no innovation on the proof of work side, which just makes me sad, because there are some good protocols like Prism and other things that from Pramod Viswanathan and Bitcoin NG and these other, which should have been followed. And so, it's kind of an unfair fight. So 2-3 years, we'll clean up the proof of stake. It's an industry-wide thing, but we think we have the best platform for that long-term. It's kind of like these vaccines, the mRNA guys, they're going to win long-term because of just the economics of what they've done, the programmability of what they've done. A new variant. Yeah. 2 days, we have a new, vaccine. It's like, how do you compete with that? Compared to growing a chicken egg, it's a lot of work. So that's one side of it. Another side of it is that I would like to see Catalyst continue to bloom and blossom into a full-scale voting system that bestows legitimacy to hard forks and creates a government for a cryptocurrency that is decentralized. It has no central actors. So that's a huge task. We're really making major strides and inroads there, and bringing really cool people together like John Buck and others to help us with that. but there's an enormous amount of work to do. But in 2 to 3 years, I think it's a reasonable period of time to change the way that people look at blockchain governments from a nice to have experiment to absolutely essential for stability and adoption and growth. The problem with blockchains with anarchy, that's where Bitcoin lives, is that they get to a certain point where your values intrinsically change from rapid growth and innovation to custodianship of what we already have. So Bitcoin knows it needs smart contracts. Bitcoin knows it needs better crypto. Bitcoin knows it needs faster transactions and instant finality and these types of things if it truly wishes to get to the next level as a system. But there's no governance system to force that change. So you have to have a 3-year debate to get SegWit and a slight block size increase. And even that results in Bitcoin Cash. And we're small compared to the world. So what happens when Bitcoin has 100 million users or a billion users? You can't change anything. Zero, you just die. There's in all living systems, artificial to ecological to big ecosystems, you have to have the ability to change to adapt to your environment. And if you don't, you die. And there's no exception to that rule in the long term. So a governance layer, if we can prove that it works and it can scale and handle millions of people, we have a change engine that is infinitely better than all other actors. And because our actors are open source, it means we're like the Borg. We can go around and just absorb all their good, cool stuff and take all their good, cool communities and bring them in. So that alone would guarantee that Cardano is the #1 cryptocurrency. So I'd love to accomplish that, but it's actually the hardest problem. Vitalik is totally ignoring it. He wrote blog posts saying how hard it is, and he's absolutely right. It's an extremely difficult problem in practice, and it's going to consume a big part of my 30s, dealing with that and attacking that and tackling it and bringing people to bear for it. In the next 5 years in particular, it's going to be real fun to wrangle. And then the last thing I'd love to see is the Cardano be able to adopt a lot of these next generation things, optimistic ZK rollups. I'd love to see recursive snarks come in for scalability solutions and for full node security like clients. And I'd like to see a bundling of state channels, identity, and Cardano together in a very beautiful way. We have Hydra and Prism combined with Cardano. I'd like to see that merger happen. It's probably not going to fully happen this year, but I think within the 2 to 3 year time horizon, it's going to occur. And then you have a perfect system for micropayments, a perfect system for high throughput. We can compete with Visa plus MasterCard plus all these other systems. But then you also have a very stable backbone. And then, of course, everything can be regulated and unregulated because you can embed identity and metadata into every transaction to meet the needs of the consumer. So these are the kinds of things that we're chasing. And we have the right teams for it, the right engineers for it. And we have a great ecosystem for these things.
I guess, because you're so excited about Catalyst, how does one participate in the network with Catalyst? What does the voting system look like? Is there the staking that's involved?
Well, yeah, it's a slightly permission system in that you have to have ADA to participate at the moment. And that's rightfully so. Point of ADA is you have a say in where ADA is going to go. Unlike Bitcoin or Ethereum or these other things, you don't have to trust your masters or your betters. You actually have a say. So if you go to cardano.ideascale.com, we partnered with a great company called IdeaScale. They've been in innovation management for over 10 years. And basically, they have a platform that we're using to host the conversations about voting rounds. And so it's end to end. The discussions, the submission of a funding ballot saying, hey, here's my idea. Can you come and fund me? There's all kinds of Zoom calls and community meetups and things that occur. And then inevitably, if you have ADA, there's a way to register it to vote. Then you can vote. The people who have the most votes win. So far, 11 projects have been funded because we've just gotten it started for public voting. And this year we'll do 8 to 9 rounds. So probably hundreds of projects, all things considered. And the rounds keep getting larger. The Fund 2 round was only $250,000. The next one, I think, is either $500,000 or $1 million. I can't remember. It's a lot. It's a lot of cheddar. And as ADA goes up and the community gets larger, eventually the rounds will be $5 to $10 million for each round every 6 to 8 weeks. In fact, I think this year we have up to $100 million the Treasury is producing for projects and ideas. So the demographics will change. It'll go from, hey, I want to get Arduino microcontroller support and feed chickens with the Cardano network, or hey, I want to print some t-shirts, to, hey, I'm actually an established company with a real brand, maybe Line or Telegram. and I want to do a deep Cardano integration, for this amount of money, and here's what we're bringing. And so you actually go into like strategic partnerships and venture capital and so forth. It's really cool, the dynamics that are going to form. And it also can be used to fund research. So eventually research labs and scientists will come and say, I'm going to do a long arc zero knowledge research program for 5 years at this university if you subsidize the creation of a lab. Okay, you can do that kind of stuff. So Catalyst is the beginning, but not the end of governance. We have many things. We even have another project that's running. It's a Horizons 2020 project from the European Union that we're doing with IBM Research and Guard Time. And that's all about decentralized software updates. And we got a grant from the European Union for it. And we've been working on that for now about 3 years. And so we're trying to merge these two systems together. So we almost have like a bicameral model for software updates. So this year is a very petri dish experiment year. And we're throwing everything in the kitchen sink, and we have thousands and thousands of people already registered and participating. And the product manager there is overwhelmed. No matter how many people I give him, he's always behind because there's just so much to do and so many great conversations being. You can get lost in it.
I love it. I'm definitely grabbing some 88 to become a part of that community. I think this idea behind voting is super important, and I want to see what kind of cool stuff you guys are producing. Look, when you brought up Kiva the first time in your TEDx talk, you really sold me. I have such a soft spot in my heart for these programs that are already helping the underbanked and the underserved in areas where they're have the hardest trouble, people that don't have identification. Now, there's one person here that has asked me multiple times to ask this one specific question, and he's interested in Burma, and is Cardano able to in any way help during military coups? He's like, you've already said that you're expanding to projects in Southeast Asia. Is Burma on that list specifically?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So we have a great Cardano community in Vietnam. We have a good Cardano community in Cambodia, and we have some connections in Indonesia. I think we both have personal connections to Indonesia. And I was on the Jakarta, Java side, and I guess you're on the Bali side. And I have personal connection to the Philippines as well. So, we're all around, Oceania and Southeast Asia. And Burma is an interesting place. And, they were a country that for a long time had a military presence ruling everything. And then they switched over to a democracy. There were certainly problems with that democracy, with the Rohingya and allegations of ethnic cleansing and other such things. And it's unclear, what's true, what's not true. But, setting all those politics aside, what looks like has occurred is that the military has resumed control of the country. And this is very common in unstable democracies. And that actually is a great point for why cryptocurrencies are necessary. Because even though you can't control the particulars of the leadership of your country, like Assad is in charge of Syria one day and then ISIS takes over the next day, and maybe it's Assad, maybe it's someone else the next day, you would like to at least know that the records are there. One of the most devastating things about the Holocaust was that all the records were destroyed. It was incredibly difficult to find out who owned what, where did the paintings belong, where did the gold belong, these types of things. The Nazis were exceedingly efficient at erasing as much history as they could. And so the cleanup has taken decades. There's still issues, in 2021. Now, if you can put all those records and that history on a blockchain, even if there's a military junta, they can't erase it. So when peace comes back, democracy comes back, you can at least get history rewound to that point. Now, if assets can be digitized, they cannot be seized. So when you become a refugee, a diaspora, and flee your country, you can take more than your t-shirt with you. You can actually take some of your net wealth with you, which is super important. You also can take your reputation and your identity with you. What if you're a prominent Burmese physician who is well regarded in the community and you flee to a neighboring country? You'd like to be able to prove that you're a surgeon and you have all these skills and you were well regarded and be able to, but what if you can't take it? And of course, the military government won't allow records to leave or destroy your records or adulterate them. Then you have to start basically from the ground up and go work at UPS or something, the local equivalent of it, and so that's just devastating for somebody. Viktor Frankl wrote about this in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. He had been doing medical research for a long time before he was thrown in a concentration camp, and the Nazis destroyed all of his medical research and kind of stripped him of all the things that he had held dear, from his family to his reputation. So he walked out of the camp literally having to start over in every dimension, not exactly as a young person. The point of our industry is it prevents that at the very least. And if it can be digitized, it gives you the way to take it with you when these things occur. And then also, it can create guarantees of freedom of association, commerce, and expression. For those who don't leave and want to fight the good fight of resisting evil and tyranny, it gives them tools to be underground journalists. Now, this is near and dear to my heart because I'm quarter Norwegian. And my family on the Norwegian side, they didn't like it when the Nazis came. They were sheep herders and farmers, and they were just like normal everyday. And the Nazis came, they said, "Oh, we're not going to tolerate this." So they went and lived in ice caves and started blowing stuff up for 3 years. They would have underground shortwave radio stations and things like that, and they'd hide stuff in like little wooden shoes and shit. And then when the war ended, they went back to being, sheep farmers and herders and so forth. So the ability to resist tyranny is also extremely important. And with a new age of surveillance and a new age of tyrannical tools, we need a counterbalance to these things. And I think cryptocurrencies are going to play one of the most significant roles in resistance against these regimes in the 21st century. And, whether that's convenient or not for governments, I just couldn't care less. I really couldn't. Fuck them. We need these tools, or else we will lose all of our freedoms gradually like a boiling frog.
Yeah, this is one of those things I kind of learned along the way, the importance of just the collateral registry of not just self, but of the property you might own. I mean, my gardener, for instance, fantastic man, owns 34 acres here or 34 hectares, which is an enormous amount of property. He owns more than both of us, I think. But anyways, the point of this is in Costa Rica, we have an open land registry. You can go online. It's a secure database where you can see who's owned what since the 1960s. We also have no military in Costa Rica. Anyways, total side topic, but I never realized that during wartime, it was like a focus of the military to try to aim at these registries of housing and property databases to just throw things into dismay for as long as possible. This is just the things you don't think about when you're growing up in a relatively stable society are property rights. So Charles, I'm really grateful to have you on the show today. Thank you. You helped me learn a bunch today. I think my community is going to find this fantastic. I'm definitely a big supporter of you and Cardano now. That was such a unique experience. I know we had briefly talked about mushrooms and you're wanting to grow those. These are the kinds of things that really help me understand the individuals behind the technology. So I'm grateful that you do so many AMAs and that you're willing to come on someone random like myself show and share your thoughts with us.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you inviting me on. I mean, I love these types of interviews because they're diverse and we can go over more than the usual set of topics. I mean, the problem with a lot of YouTubers is they say, when is it going up? How can you promise me that it's going up? And, how can you convince my audience to buy your token? That's literally what the interview is about. And I have no interest in those interviews. These markets are crazy and I have no idea if they're going up or down. I've lived through, I've gone from $1 Bitcoin to $30 Bitcoin to $4 Bitcoin to $260 Bitcoin, back down to $80 Bitcoin to $1,200 Bitcoin to $250 Bitcoin to $20,000 Bitcoin to $4,000 Bitcoin down to $35,000 Bitcoin in an 8-year period. I couldn't tell you how that works. If I could, I'd be the world's richest fucking man. I mean, come on, it's like pointless to me. But what matters more is the principles and the philosophies and the values. And how did we get to where we're at and where are we going and why do we do what we do? And you mentioned agriculture. I think that's one of the most important things for all people is to be connected to the earth in some way. When you're a farmer, it is the most humbling and honest thing you can do as a human being. The plant does not give a shit if you're Bill Gates or Charles Hoskinson or somebody else. If you don't treat it right, it won't grow. It won't grow properly. You have to treat the soil right. You have to plan ahead. You have to show up every day and care for it. And then if you do, you get the fruits of your labors. Getting that into a child early on, this is what Elon Musk's brother Kimball does. He builds these beautiful modular farms for school kids. It's one of his passion projects. He also runs some restaurants. It's such a valuable lesson because it shows you reap what you sow, and it's such a human thing. The other thing is that once you realize you can create something, because most people don't realize that they have tremendous creative capacity. We're told what to do. We're told what to think. We're told when to show up, when to leave. We're told how the world works. When you realize you can create something, you can crossbreed things, you can do things differently. Your imagination is the limiting factor in many cases. They say, oh, but I'm resource constrained. No, if you have a great imagination and a great plan, you can find somebody with resources and convince them to give them those resources. All these cryptocurrencies came about because somebody convinced another person to put in something to get them where they needed to go. It wasn't magic. It wasn't like the richest people in the world met in a room and said, this is the way the world economy is going to work. Let's go do it. No, ICOs were literally of the people. The first one was Mastercoin. J.R. Willett, he was sitting in his, I think his mom's basement, you know, a little desktop computer, a little white tower. He said, I want to raise some money. Here's the Exodus address. And he raised $500,000. Now, where the hell did that come from? Was that organized? No, it wasn't even regulated back then. And so all these people just showed up and sent him Bitcoin. Hallelujah. So once you realize you can create things and you realize you have some control over that, it makes you wonder, where can I go with this? What dimensions can I go with this? Where can I take this? And then you can extend that to every dimension of your life. And I think it's just such a powerful lesson for people to have, integrate to their character.
Just so one last thing here. When's the next Catalyst kind of voting series hit the table?
Oh, it's going on right now. Fund 3. I think they're in the, if I remember correctly, you'll have to invite Dor on. He's our product manager for it, but I think they're in the review phase where people are submitting ballots, and then there's discussion, then there's registration to vote, and then voting. So I think we're early to mid in Fund 3, and you'll be able to see the winners. But Dor tracks all of that, and I drop in from time to time. I try to stay a little away from it right now because it's such a time sink that it's like a video game. If you get really ingrained into it, you're done. And we got several hard fork combinator events for Goguen coming out. I'm very focused on that, while Dor focuses on Voltaire because it's a parallel network running with Cardano.
Oh, see, there's so much to learn in this ecosystem for someone like myself who lives in the jungle. Charles, one of the ways I wanted to thank you as and kind of and a highlight one of the platforms I'm such a big fan of is I put a little bit of capital into Kiva today. So for those of you that don't know, Kiva is a nonprofit organization that makes microloans to underserved and underbanked entrepreneurs around the world. So because you said you liked agriculture, I found a woman here that's looking to grab more fertilizer. She's from Cambodia. She needs a loan of another $475. So we're going to get her halfway there. I think I've got 250 on there today. So we'll go 225, just a little bit lower. Now, so this is my way to thank you. I think everyone, if you haven't yet, go check out Kiva. It's a fantastic platform. It allows you to make loans to entrepreneurs that end up paying you back effectively. So this is a really unique way. Perfect. Just squeeze under the cuff there. And it's, I mean, again, one of the, why was I not signed in? One sec. I don't know why it signed me out here. When I first got to this ecosystem, the thing that really sold me was the ability to help the underbanked and the underprivileged, I guess, to some degree, because I spent a lot of time living in indigenous Guatemala, and I just saw the needs of these people who had lost their identification, had no real access to anything. I was a big fan of this. So here we go. Should be able to be signed in now. I was kind of hoping it wouldn't to retake me through this checkout process. Oh no. Okay, I apologize for this one second here, Charles, but we're going to make a contribution. And again,
okay.
I just want to, I love Kiva so much. And when you first brought up Kiva in your TEDx Burma talk, that's was like, okay, I really like, I love this guy. Like this is the exact area that we, I think is interesting to go over. So now let's see here. Can I fix that now? Okay. Yeah, there we go. That should be able to do it. I apologize for the little delay there. They're not a tech company, so it accidentally logged me out. So Savet in Cambodia, who needs a little bit of extra stuff to help grow food in her agriculture, we're making her a loan. We'll share it on Twitter. Thanks to Charles. Again, the best thing I can do, I figure to kind of repay you for the time you spent with us today, even though it's not like anything particular, is tag you, say again, thank you. Thanks for the show today. Anyways, there you go. This is, again, thank you so much for your time, Charles. I know you're a busy guy. You got a lot of stuff going on, to be able to go out and share with the community. And I think it's such an important part of how we all learn and grow. So I'm deeply grateful for the work you do, your AMAs and your constant updates. I think it's brilliant.
Oh, this is so cool. Thank you so much for your time. And I think I might integrate Kiva in some clever way with my AMAs. I'll see what I can do with that.
Yeah, you can, one of the new features that they added is, so we've got a team now. So if people can make loans as part of the Arcane Bear, and we ranked number 2 in the businesses to join Kiva this month. And we've only loaned like a few $1,000s. We've only loaned like,
Right.
I think $3,000 this month or something. So it's jump in there. I really appreciate the sentiments behind it. And I love the work that you're doing.
Cheers. Thank you so much. This was so much fun.
I had a great time too.